Chapter 3, Part 3 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marcetich, Alexandria, Virginia, June 2009. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 3, A Jaguar Hunt on the Taquery, Part 3. An interesting incident occurred on the day we killed our first jaguar. We took our lunch beside a small but deep and obviously permanent pond. I went to the edge to dip up some water, and something growled or bellowed at me only a few feet away. It was a Jaguar or small caiman about 5 feet long. I paid no heed to it at the moment, but shortly afterwards, when our horses went down to drink, it threatened them and frightened them, and then Colonel Rondon and Kermit called me to watch it. It lay on the surface of the water only a few feet distant from us and threatened us. We threw cakes of mud at it, whereupon it clashed its jaws and made short rushes at us, and when we threw sticks it seized them and crunched them. We could not drive it away. Why it should have shown such truculence and heedlessness I cannot imagine, unless perhaps it was a female, with eggs near by. In another little pond a Jaguar showed no less anger when another of my companions approached. It bellowed, opened its jaws, and lashed its tail, yet these pond jaguares never actually molested even our dogs in the ponds, far less us on our horses. This same day others of our party had an interesting experience with the creatures in another pond. One of them was Commander da Cunha, of the Brazilian Navy, a capital sportsman and delightful companion. They found a deepish pond about 100 yards or so long and 30 or 40 across. It was tenanted by the small caimans and by capybaras, the largest known rodent, a huge aquatic guinea pig, the size of a small sheep. It also swarmed with piranhas, the ravenous fish of which I have so often spoken. Undoubtedly the caimans were subsisting largely on these piranhas, but the tables were readily turned if any caimans were injured. When a capybara was shot and sank in the water, the piranhas at once attacked it, and had eaten half the carcass 10 minutes later. But much more extraordinary was the fact that when a caiman about 5 feet long was wounded, the piranhas attacked and tore it, and actually drove it out on the bank to face its human foes. The fish first attacked the wound, then, as the blood maddened them, they attacked all the soft parts, their terrible teeth cutting out chunks of tough hide and flesh. Eventually they did not molest either caiman or capybara while it was unwounded, but blood excited them to frenzy. Their habits are in some ways inexplicable. We saw men frequently bathing unmolested, but there are places where this is never safe, and in any place if a school of the fish appears, swimmers are in danger, and a wounded man or beast is in deadly peril if piranhas are in the neighborhood. Ordinarily it appears that an unwounded man is attacked only by accident. Such accidents are rare, but they happen with sufficient frequency to justify much caution in entering water where piranhas abound. We frequently came across ponds tenanted by numbers of capybaras. The huge, pig-like rodents are said to be shy elsewhere. Here they were tame. The water was their home and refuge. They usually went ashore to feed on the grass, and made well-beaten trails in the marsh immediately around the water, but they must have traveled these at night, for we never saw them more than a few feet away from the water in the daytime. Even at midday we often came on them standing beside a bayou or pond. The dogs would rush wildly at such a standing beast, which would wait until they were only a few yards off, and then dash into and under the water. The dogs would also run full tilt into the water, and it was then really funny to see their surprise and disappointment at the sudden and complete disappearance of their quarry. Often a capybara would stand or sit on its haunches in the water, with only its blunt, short-eared head above the surface, quite heedless of our presence. But if alarmed it would dive, for capybaras swim with equal facility on or below the surface, and if they wish to hide, they rise gently among the rushes or water-lily leaves, with only their nostrils exposed. In these waters the capybara and small caimans paid no attention to one another, swimming and resting in close proximity. They both had the same enemy, the jaguar. The capybara is a game animal only in the sense that a hare or rabbit is. The flesh is good to eat, and its amphibious habits are queer. Nature and surroundings make it interesting. In some of the ponds the water had about gone, and the capybaras had become for the time being beasts of the marsh and the mud, although they could always find little slimy pools under a mass of water lilies in which to lie and hide. Our whole stay on this ranch was delightful. On the long rides we always saw something of interest, and often it was something entirely new to us. Early one morning we came across two armadillos, the big 9-banded armadillo. We were riding with a pack through a dry, sandy pasture country, dotted with clumps of palms, round the trunks of which grew a dense jungle of thorns and Spanish bayonets. The armadillos were feeding in an open space between two of these jungle clumps, which were about 100 yards apart. One was on all fours, the other was in a squatting position, with its forelegs off the ground. The long ears were very prominent. The dogs raced at them. I had always supposed that armadillos merely shuffled along and curled up for protection when menaced, and I was almost surprised, as if I had seen a turtle gallop, when these two armadillos bounced off at a run, going as fast as rabbits. One headed back for the nearest patch of jungle, which it reached. The other ran at full speed, and ran really fast, too, until it nearly reached the other patch, 100 yards distant, the dogs in full cry immediately behind it. Then it suddenly changed its mind, wheeled in its tracks, and came back like a bullet right through the pack. Dog after dog tried to seize it or stop it, and turned to pursue it, but its wedge-shaped snout and armored body, joined to the speed at which it was galloping, enabled it to dive straight ahead through its pursuers, not one of which could halt it or grasp it, and it reached in safety its thorny haven of refuge. It had run at speed about 150 yards. I was much impressed by this unexpected exhibition. Evidently this species of armadillo only curls up as a last resort, and ordinarily trusts to its speed, and to the protection its build and armor give it, while running, in order to reach its burrow or other place of safety. Twice, while laying railway tracks near Sao Paulo, Kermit had accidentally dug up armadillos with a steam shovel. There were big ant hills, some of them huge dimensions, scattered through the country. Sometimes they were built against the stems of trees. We did not here come across any of the poisonous or biting ants which, when sufficiently numerous, render certain districts uninhabitable. They are ordinarily not very numerous. Those of them that march in large bodies kill nesting birds, and at once destroy any big animal unable to get out of their way. It has been suggested that nestlings in their nests are in some way immune from the attack of these ants. The experiments of our naturalists tended to show that this was not the case. They plundered any nest they came across and could get at. Once we saw a small herd of peccaries, one a sow followed by 3 little pigs. They are said to have only 2 young, but we saw 3, although of course it is possible one belonged to another sow. The herd galloped into a mass of thorny cover the hounds could not penetrate, and when they were in safety we heard them utter, from the depths of the jungle, a curious moaning sound. In one ride we passed a clump of palms which were fairly ablaze with bird color. There were magnificent hyacinth macaws, green parrots with red splashes, toucans with varied plumage, black, white, red, yellow, green hawkmars, flaming orioles, and both blue and dark red tanagers. It was an extraordinary collection. All were noisy. Perhaps there was also a snake that had drawn them by its presence, but we could find no snake. The assembly dispersed as we rode up. The huge blue macaws departed in pairs, uttering their hoarse "ar rar rar, ar rar rar." It has been said that parrots in the wilderness are only noisy on the wing. They were certainly noisy on the wing, and those that we saw were quiet while they were feeding; but ordinarily when they were perched among the branches, and especially when, as in the case of the little parakeets near the house, they were gathering materials for nest building, they were just as noisy while flying. The water birds were always a delight. We shot merely the 2 or 3 specimens the naturalist needed for the museum. I killed a wood ibis on the wing with the handy little Springfield, and then lost all the credit I had thus gained by a series of inexcusable misses at long range before I finally killed a jabiru. Kermit shot a jabiru with the Luger automatic. The great splendid birds, standing about as tall as a man, show fight when wounded, and advance against their assailants, clattering their formidable bills. One day we found the nest of a jabiru in a mighty fig tree, on the edge of a patch of jungle. It was a big platform of sticks, placed on a horizontal branch. There were 4 half-grown young standing on it. We passed it in the morning, when both parents were also perched alongside. The sky was then overcast, and it was not possible to photograph it with the small camera. In the early afternoon, when we again passed it, the sun was out, and we tried to get photographs. Only one parent bird was present at this time. It showed no fear. I noticed that, as it stood on a branch near the nest, its bill was slightly open. It was very hot, and I suppose it had opened its bill just as a hen opens her bill in hot weather. As we rode away, the old bird and the 4 young birds were standing motionless, and with gliding flight the other old bird was returning to the nest. It is hard to give an adequate idea of the wealth of bird life in these marshes. A naturalist could, with the utmost advantage, spend 6 months on such a branch as that we visited. He would have to do some collecting, but only a little. Exhaustive observation in the field is what is now most needed. Most of this wonderful and harmless bird life should be protected by law, and the mammals should receive reasonable protection. The books now most needed are those dealing with the life histories of wild creatures. Near the ranch house, walking familiarly among the cattle, we saw the big, deep-billed Ani blackbirds. They feed on the insects disturbed by the hoofs of the cattle, and often cling to them and pick off the ticks. It was the end of the nesting season, and we did not find their curious communal nests, in which half a dozen females lay their eggs indiscriminately. The common ibises in the ponds near by, which usually went in pairs, instead of in flocks like the wood ibis, were very tame, and so were the night herons and all the small herons. In flying, the ibises and storks stretched the necks straight in front of them. The jabiru, a splendid bird on the wing, also stretches his neck out in front, but there appears to be a slight downward curve at the base of the neck, which may be due merely to the craw. The big slender herons, on the contrary, bend the long neck back in a beautiful curve, so that the head is nearly between the shoulders. One day I saw what I at first thought was a small yellow-bellied kingfisher hovering over a pond, and finally plunging down to the surface of the water after a school of tiny young fish. But it proved to be a bien te vie kingbird, curved-bill woodhewers, birds the size and somewhat the coloration of veeries, but with long, slender sickle bills, were common in the little garden back of the house. Their habits were those of creepers, and they scrambled with agility up, along, and under the trunks and branches, and along the posts and rails of the fence, thrusting the bill into crevices for insects. The oven birds, which had the carriage and somewhat the look of wood thrushes, I am sure would prove delightful friends on a close acquaintance. They are very individual, not only in the extraordinary domed mud nests they build, but in all their ways, in their bright alertness, their interest and in curiosity about whatever goes on, their rather jerky quickness of movement, and their loud and varied calls. With a little encouragement they become tame and familiar. The parakeets were too noisy, but otherwise were most attractive little birds, as they flew to and fro and scrambled about in the top of the palm behind the house. There was one showy kind of kingbird or tyrant flycatcher, lustrous black with a white head. One afternoon several score cattle were driven into a big square corral near the house, in order to brand the calves and a number of unbranded yearlings and 2-year-olds. A special element of excitement was added by the presence of a dozen big bulls, which were to be turned into draught oxen. The agility, nerve, and prowess of the ranch workmen, the herders or gauchos, were noteworthy. The dark-skinned men were obviously mainly of Indian and Negro descent, although some of them also showed a strong strain of white blood. They wore the usual shirt, trousers, and fringed leather apron, with Jim Crow hats. Their bare feet must have been literally as tough as horn, for when one of them roped a big bull he would brace himself, standing back until he was almost sitting down and digging his heels into the ground, and the galloping beast would be stopped short and whirled completely round when the rope tautened. The maddened bulls and an occasional steer or cow charged again and again with furious wrath, but 2 or 3 ropes would settle on the doomed beast, and down it would go, and when it was released and rose and charged once more, with greater fury than ever, the men, shouting with laughter, would leap up the sides of the heavy stockade. We stayed at the ranch a couple of days before Christmas. Hitherto the weather had been lovely. The night before we left there was a torrential tropic downpour. It was not unexpected, for we had been told that the rainy season was overdue. The following forenoon the baggage started, in a couple of 2-wheeled ox carts, for the landing, where the steamboat awaited us. Each cart was drawn by 8 oxen. The huge wheels were over 7 feet high. Early in the afternoon we followed on horseback, and overtook the carts as darkness fell, just before we reached the landing on the river's bank. The last few miles, after the final reaches of higher, tree-clad ground had been passed, were across a level plain of low ground on which the water stood, sometimes only up to the ankles of a man on foot, sometimes as high as his waist. Directly in front of us, many leagues distant, rose the bold mountains that lie west of Corumba. Behind them the sun was setting and kindled the overcast heavens with lurid splendor. Then the last rose tints faded from the sky. The horses plodded wearily through the water. On every side stretched the marsh, vast, lonely, desolate in the gray of the half light. We overtook the ox carts. The cattle strained in the yokes, the drivers wading alongside cracked their whips and uttered strange cries. The carts rocked and swayed as the huge wheels churned through the mud and water. As the last light faded, we reached the small patches of dry land at the landing, where the flat-bottomed, side-wheel steamboat was moored to the bank. The tired horses and oxen were turned loose to graze. Water stood in the corrals, but the open shed was on dry ground. Under it the half-clad, wild-looking ox-drivers and horse-herders slung their hammocks, and close by they lit a fire and roasted, or scorched, slabs of legs and mutton, spitted on sticks and propped above the smouldering flame. Next morning, with real regret, we waved good-bye to our dusky attendants, as they stood on the bank, grouped around a little fire and beside the big empty ox-carts. A dozen miles downstream, a rowboat fitted for a spritsail put off from the bank. The owner, a countryman from a small ranch, asked for a tow to Corumba, which we gave. He had with him in the boat his comely brown wife, who was smoking a very large cigar, their 2 children, a young man, and a couple of trunks and various other belongings. On Christmas Eve we reached Corumba and rejoined the other members of the expedition. Chapter 4